Shabbat Shalom. I'm Rick Rheins, the Senior Rabbi at Temple Sinai here in Denver, and we are going to talk a little bit about Vayechi. Vayechi is the last of the parasha in the book of Genesis. And we will not only read the last of the book of Genesis, but it's also the last Shabbat of the year 2020. So hold down your enthusiasm for that. Vayechi, and he lived. It details the last 17 years of Jacob's life. Jacob is no longer in the promised land. He's no longer in the place where Abraham and Isaac, where Sarah and Rebekah raised the family. Jacob now is down with his children in the land of Egypt. It's a transition story. This whole Shabbat is a transition. The transition from Genesis to Exodus, the transition of a new year, the transition from Jacob's point of view, Jacob, Israel, the transition from the times of the patriarchs and matriarchs to a diaspora story. This is the beginning of our diaspora experience. Now consider that in the land of Canaan, in that land which would become Eretz Yisrael, this land where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel and Leah, Bilhah and Zilpah established their family, where they had this pastoral scene of their herds and their flocks and this monotheism with God. They're now down in Egypt. Now, Egypt was a far cry from the pastoral scene in the land of Canaan. Egypt was the major power in the world, the superpower of the world. It dominated not only militarily, but culturally. And it was a land that had so much to offer in riches. The Nile provided a steady source of income, of food for people, so they would come down to Egypt to survive the famine, which is how the children of Israel came to Egypt in the first place. So now Jacob, after these 17 years in Egypt, begins to worry. He said, this transition from the days of my ancestors to this current time, and I can look ahead to what will happen to my children and my children's children, and I'm quite worried. I'm worried because this very attractive culture of Egypt will soon become dominant. They won't know at all what the life was in the land of Canaan, that promised land. They won't know from monotheism. In ancient Egypt, there were over 2,000 different gods. Gods of the Nile, like the crocodile, gods of the sky, like the falcon, and even gods in human form, like the pharaoh. Over 2,000 idols or gods that they worshiped. And we were a people who worshiped the one God, the God that couldn't be seen. How would our people be able to survive? And Jacob, Israel, was rightly concerned. In chapter 49 of the book of Genesis, Jacob calls all the children together and he says, I'm going to tell you about the end of days. He was hoping to give them that final charge that there will be a time when they would leave Egypt and go back to Israel. But as the commentators mentioned, he didn't continue on that theme. Perhaps he realized, as Rashi said, that he wanted to speak of hakates, of the end of the galut, of this diaspora, of this experience of being strangers in the strange land. But he knew that either A, it wasn't up to him to share those secrets, or B, to really admit he had no clue. It just so happened that that diaspora story that our earliest ancestors experienced would be a template for all the subsequent diaspora stories, i.e. would come as strangers into a strange land. And we would have some success, some security at first. We would accommodate, we would become one with that culture, assimilate into their language, their dress, their ways, their customs, keeping our Jewish identity, of course, but thinking that we were accepted by all of our neighbors, only to have a new Pharaoh arise who knew not Joseph. A new tyrant would arise, a new Caesar, a new Haman, a Führer, who would make those Jews in those lands realize that they were still considered strangers in someone else's land. Jacob couldn't tell them all about that. He couldn't predict that. He couldn't predict what would happen to them. He didn't know that there would be times, even after the oppression, times of redemption, times in which we would flee that land of oppression to find a land more secure. We all know that that story is played out until the modern era. Modern Israel was created for that very same reason. Jacob couldn't have known that, which is why Rashi said he wanted to tell about the hakates, about the end, but he stopped. They're not things that we can always predict. We look forward to this new year, 2021. We can't make predictions. It's not up for us to know what will happen, but we can prepare ourselves for come what may. Look back, the beginning of this past year, 2020, we had so many plans and expectations. We had all of our agendas set, and it's all blown by the wind. And we've realized that no matter what happens, we can adjust. We can figure out a new way to persevere as long as we have that which is inside us. So I want to conclude with this little midrash, which talks about this very scene where Jacob has gathered all of the children of Israel together, and they're at his bedside, and he's expressing to them his hope that they will not forget this promised land back in Canaan, that they would not forget that there's one God, a God you can't see or talk to or feel or make a picture of or make a statue of, but a God that unites all existence, one God, Adonai. And he tried to tell them about that, worried that they would be attracted instead by all the many idolatrous opportunities in this fancy and tremendous culture of Egypt. And his children realized that Jacob was afraid. And so they said to him, Shema Yisrael. Listen, Israel. Listen, our father Jacob. Adonai Eloheinu. The Lord is our God. Adonai, the one God of all existence, is our God. Adonai Echad. And that God alone will be our God. Jacob could relax, knowing that his children had what it takes, not necessarily the strength of arms, not necessarily the riches, not necessarily being the most clever, but people who had a faith, people who had a conviction that no matter what would happen, if they had faith and they had conviction, they had their principles, they'll be okay. And so will we. No matter what happens in this year, 2021, we're going to be okay. We need our faith. We need our principles. We need each other. We need God. And may God's blessings shine upon you and all humanity in this new year. Blessings of good health and happiness and peace. Shabbat Shalom.